Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. On today's episode, we're doing another continuation of the last two episodes, but on today's episode, we're going to cover abdominals and the lower back. So, let's kick it. Steph, before I jump right into going over the exercises I've selected, I kind of wanted to have you just talk on the importance of the abdominals and why we use them in our programming.
Yeah. So the thing is, what I've noticed over the years, I mean, it's kind of interesting, right? The entire fitness industry is very like trend based. And there's periods of time where things gets popular, it disappears, and it comes back. Now, in the 70s and 80s, abdominal training was huge. Like, it was almost like overkill, overdone. I remember when I started, it was like every day you start with a broomstick rotation for 5 minutes, then you're doing abs for 20, 30 minutes. Like, it was so much ab work. Then, like early to mid 90s, it kind of disappeared. And I remember late 90s, early 2000, one of the premise or one of the reasons or the talk was that, well, if you're training big compound movements and you're training like heavy squats and heavy deadlifts and heavy presses like overhead and chin-ups, this works the abdominals very well. So then you don't need to train abs. And a lot of people went that route. But the problem, and I always say that in class, the key word in that sentence is heavy squats and heavy deadlift. So the problem is if you're training clients and you have that mindset, so you're not programming abdominal work because you're squatting and deadlifting, but the client is squatting 65 pounds or deadlifting 135 pounds, well, now the problem is these are not heavy squats and heavy deadlift. Actually, there was this study, it was done in the early 2000s, where they measured abdominal wall activity, and one of the highest stimulating movement to engage the core muscle was a squat at a quarter squat at 3 to 4 times body weight. And this created a huge activation of the abdominal wall. But what did I just say?
Who does that?
3 to 4 times body weight quarter squat. So yeah, cool. But if you're doing 65-pound squat for sets of 8, there's not much going on. It doesn't matter that your 65-pound squat is your 8 RM. There's just not enough flow to warrant extreme activation of the abdominal wall. So considering that the trunk, so the combination of the abdominal wall and the lower back are so important for the expression of strength and sporting action, they're kind of like the transmitter of force from the lower body to the upper body. It is really important. And because so many people are weak in the big lifts, they need to train the abs and lower back in isolation in order to build a base. Now, once you've built a solid base and you're able to squat a lot of weight, yeah, you can like take time away from it in isolation and still maintain abdominal and lower back strain. But in the early stages with anyone, it needs to be prioritized up to a certain point. And the thing is, a lot of people sometimes they hit a plateau in their big lifts, and they going like so many routes and so many ways to try to figure out why am I hitting a plateau. But sometimes it's as simple as, well, your abs are just too weak. Yep. So it is important to train the abdominals, train the spinal erectors, so that you have a properly developed trunk. Now, the way we like to look at abdominal training, so we're looking at all of we're looking at the trunk through 3 main like families, if you want. So we have stabilization, and by stabilization we're talking about like anti-flexion, anti-extension, anti-lateral flexion. So anything that's bracing dominant, like a front plank, a side plank, a Pallof press, a isometric back extension. All of this are anti-whatever, and they would qualify as stabilizers. So you need to be able to stabilize the trunk first before you start increasing its strength in a dynamic fashion. Now, we also have rotational work. So, Russian twist, wood chop. So any type of abdominal action that is in a transverse plane. And then finally, we have flexion work or extension work. So, like dynamic, isotonic back extension would be an example for the spinal erectors, whereas now a classic sit-up would be a good example for spinal flexion or trunk flexion. So we work flexion in two ways. We work spinal flexion, spinal extension. We work hip flexion and hip extension. So hip extension, a reverse hyper would be a good example. Hip flexion, a Garhammer raise or hanging leg raise would be a good example. So all of these needs to be trained within the context of a macro cycle in order to optimize strength. Now, what's also really important, and this is like, it's dating. I think it's, we're talking about 1994. Watham, I forget the last name. It starts with a W, but it's this book that came out in 1994. The title is something like The Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning. And what they did is they established a proper agonist-antagonist ratio, like amount of work to accomplish on certain lifts in order to optimize the balance of musculature. And when it comes to the trunk, basically hip flexion and hip extension, we're talking about a 1-to-1 ratio. So for every set you're doing in hip flexion, you should have the equivalent in hip extension. For every set you're doing in spinal flexion, you should have the equivalent in spinal erection. So back extension to sit up, and on and on and on. So a 1-to-1 ratio seems to be the ideal in order to build that strong, stable trunk. So for us, we prioritize it, we train it. It doesn't mean you need a ton of work. I'm not talking about doing like 20 to 30 minutes of ab work every strength training session, but it needs to be trained with high return type of exercises.
I know personally for me, and I believe I've talked about it on the podcast previously, when you did, it was the end of 2023 when you did an ab specialization program for me. And I say ab specialization, but it was still just part of my session. It wasn't like standalone ab sessions. They were just built into my regular standard training. And then the year after that, it was just everything in terms of my strength felt such an improvement. I didn't have any tweaks, no injuries. And I think that ab specialization program was a huge reason for that. Yep. Okay, so now going into the first exercise I've selected. Porrick, I'll have you talk about it. The first one I pulled out was the Copenhagen.
So the Copenhagen is pretty much a side plank where for your lower body base support, you're going to be using the top leg either in a long lever or a short lever to support the weight of your body. So imagine you're in a side plank with, say we're doing the long lever Copenhagen, with your ankle of the top leg supported on the bench, your bottom legs hanging in the air. So the adductors have to create a lot of isometric force to hold that position. So this is a bit of a regression of abdominal strength as compared to what would be tested in in a side plank for max duration, but it's going to have way more stress on the adductors. So it's a very specific exercise that you can introduce if someone has adductor issues or you need to prep someone for high velocity change of directions further down the line. So it's not a very common abdominal exercise we'll introduce for the fact of building abdominal strength, but it'll be used in very specific contexts that is going to have a greater carryover to the bigger picture.
Yeah, because it was way more challenging than what I anticipated when I had it in
Oh
my
yeah,
program. For
like
the
if
first time.
anyone is going to do it, definitely start with a short lever. And to do a short lever, just do it so that it is your knee on top of the bench, and then bent knee, and then you can start lengthening that lever as you get more comfortable. But yeah, they're really hard.
And then how would you, in terms of progressing them or programming them, for how many seconds you're holding it or anything like that?
So generally short isometric bursts are better than max duration. So I would start with anything from a 4 to 6 second isometric. So say like 1014, and you're doing that for a total time under tension. Say you're aiming for 40 seconds of total time under tension. So that'll be 10 reps. Then as you progress, I would increase the time under tension of each rep, and you can either increase the total time under tension of the set as well, which would be somewhat of a double progression. So I would probably do it that I'm going up to a 6 second isometric and roughly keeping the set duration the same, and then keep the 6 second isometric, increase the set duration, then up to an 8 second isometric, maintain set duration, same with the 8 second isometric, increase set duration. But I'd only worry overly about that once I got to the long lever. Before that, I would just stick with whatever isometric duration you start with until you get to the long lever, and then build up set duration and play about with the tempos.
I didn't put a lot of like standard planks, front planks or side planks in this, but is it something with those types of planks in programming where you can change the holds from week to week basically, or would you want to still keep it standard across the mesocycle, or depending on clients?
I mean, it would depend on clients, but you would, since you can't add weight, definitely from week to week, or it could be from set to set depending on how quickly that they learn, but you could increase the isometric hold for sure.
Generally I try to have some level of progression from at least from session to session with that, whether it's the total duration of the set or the isometric holds within the set. So it depends, but you want some level of progression since there is not going to be any additional load. So you need to change some variable to ensure progression.
And then regarding the standard plank side, planks like this, what are because a lot of people use these, we use them in programming. What are the things you look out in terms of people failing on performing them properly a lot of times?
I mean, the major point of failure is often the scapula. You see a lot of people, they kind of start to sink into their shoulder and stuff. So you want to make sure that they're engaging their upper body, that they're still like pulling with, the scapula down and back. And then the hips start to sink, or they start to arch their lower back. So you really need to cue a lot, because it's easy to hold a plank and then just,
if you shoot your hips up too high,
and you're not contracting everything. You got to imagine like that the body's being stretched out. I always tell people to like reach the top of your head to one wall, and then you want to kind of imagine that someone's pulling on your heels on the other one. So you're trying to stay as long as possible. The pelvic tilt, abs, lower back.
Like for the viewers to not be confused, what's important to understand is because she's talking about the scapula, and we're talking about training the trunk, the abdominal wall, but because the trunk, the abdominal wall is a connector between the lower and upper body, it's important to understand that when you're training them, everything is interconnected. So the Copenhagen Plank, obviously you're working the adductor, but in conjunction with lateral flexion. Yeah. The plank, you're working the abdominal wall, but in conjunction with a control of the scapula. So it's all interconnected. And let's not forget that these muscles are stabilizers, fixators. So they're by default, the majority of these muscles involved in the trunk are by default slow twitch. Like a little exception to the rectus abdominis, which tends to have slightly more fast twitch fibers, but they're more involved in like eye velocity dynamic actions. But the vast majority are slow twitch. So that's why stabilizers are trained in the early stages, and they're trained usually with longer time under tension. So it's okay to have these extended 40 to 70 seconds of time under tension. But like Alex said, making sure that everything is stable is really, really important, because we're training these muscles in order to maintain stability of everything as fixators while we're doing our bigger multi-joint compound movement. So if you're doing a side plank and you're not paying attention to stabilizing the scap as you're doing it, you're missing a little bit on the training purpose of the exercise.
Yep.
Going back to the whole programming of abs, like I know we always say, we have rules, and the rules are that abs are in lower body 2. But if someone requires more ab work, you would use it in the C series on lower body 1 and 2?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's not like it needs to be done with lower body sessions, but on a organizational standpoint, it fits very well and it makes sense, especially considering that especially if you're training it in the agonist-antagonist superset double station with the lower back, it fits very well. So yes, with someone like you, when we did your ab specialization, you were doing it twice a week with lower body sessions just because it fits very well. But yeah, usually we do them on lower body too. But this is simply because the online program design course, we're offering a general structure that englobes the most important aspects of program design. But it doesn't mean that sometimes you can veer away from these standards if you have limitations.
Yeah, but if, like, say you were going to train upper body, you just have to then be careful, because if you train your abs and you train them hard in upper body and then you expect to go in and squat or deadlift really well the next day, it's going to be a limitation.
Very true, especially if you're doing like stuff like Steed Garhammer raise or
heavy stuff
like that. And also another reason why we like to do them with lower body is the shoulder joint is such a fragile joint, that if you're doing it with your upper body, then you have to kind of like pull away a little bit of like shoulder remedial work. And to me, that's too important for the majority of people to shy away from.
Would there be certain considerations you would look out for in terms of including abs into full body sessions?
You definitely can, but like my rule of thumb is I'm just following like the oldest neurological setup that most exercise physiology book talks about. Like, you finish with abs. Okay, I'm not saying you can't do it first, but it just makes more sense to finish with abs because they're fixators, they're stabilizers. You don't want to over fatigue them before you're doing big prime movers. So to train them at the end, it just makes complete sense. So let's say you're doing a full body, like doing them in a D or a E series, depending on the training modality you're doing, makes a lot of sense. There are special occasions, though. I was telling Alex, or I forget who I was talking to, maybe you, somebody, about how in order to help a client alleviate knee pain on squats.
Yeah, that was me.
So she was doing 5 sets of squats. So the squat was A1, and A2, I had that client do Copenhagen planks. To work not only the lateral flexion as a anti-lateral flexion movement, but to work the adductors as well, because that client had a significant left to right lateral flexion discrepancy, which led to her compensating on one side, which led to knee pain. So by combining the exercise in a superset like this, we created activation in the weaker area, which increased stability, which took away stress from the knee joint, and then the knee pain dissipated. But that was a very specific situation for that specific client.
And one important thing there is you said activation. So
yeah, we didn't go all out.
It's not all out. Yeah. It's done in an activating way, short of proper failure, not generating a ton of fatigue.
Yeah, it was 20 to 40 seconds of time under tension.
Yeah, so that's a really important thing. If you're going to incorporate it earlier in the session as an activation thing, make sure it is activation.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to add one thing on the Copenhagen. I've used it a lot just with the feet on the floor. Have you ever tried that one? or just the knee on the floor, or the 1 foot on the floor. With some clients that are weaker that they can't do that, it's been like, it's really hard actually. So that's definitely somewhere you can start with that one.
What would make it not like a unilateral side plank versus a Copenhagen?
Because then you would, so a regular plank, it's the bottom foot that's on the floor. So the Copenhagen, it would be your top foot. So you'd have to flex the bottom leg at the hip. Okay. So it's only the top leg that's on the floor.
Okay. The next exercise I've selected on the list is plank stir the pot.
It's like Pork's favorite.
Stir the pot is a great exercise. So the stir the pot is pretty much you're in a front plank position, but your forearms are on a Swiss ball. And then depending on the level of the trainee, you manipulate a couple of variables, whether it's speed of the circles, size of the circles. Those are the two big ones. Mm-hmm. So if you do a really slow concentric, it's obviously harder because you're spending more time at the longer lever lengths when you're extended. And then the larger the circle you do, the harder it's going to be. But it's a really good exercise because it's while you're stabilizing the trunk in the exact same way as a front plank, you're now on an unstable surface. So it's going to increase the demands for stabilization, which is what we're trying to train. And it has a longer lever length at different times. And it's not a straight, like, forward and backwards lever length. So you're bringing your body through a different range of motion. We'll have to activate different motor units and stabilize in different manners throughout the whole plank. So it's a really, really good one. Obviously, it's still very early on in like a GPP sort of situation, but it's a really, really good exercise. It's a really good bridge if you're trying to build someone up to doing ab rollouts, because you're going through that lengthened lever position at the end range, but you're only there very briefly. So it's a really good one.
So the next one is a fun one. Well, it's fun. I like it fun if you can do it with someone. It's always fun. So even if you have, like, say, a team setting or young athletes, I think it's a good one to implement. But plank walkouts.
Yes, plank walkout is, again, it's another stabilization, bracing type exercise. So it's an anti-extension type movement. So you're in a push-up position, stabilizing the trunk. Everything is braced really, really hard. And then you take small steps forward.
With your hands,
yeah. With your hands, step with your hands towards past your head, basically. So you're lengthening the lever. So you're challenging the abdominal wall more and more and more as you move forward. So it's it resembles a lot the ab wheel, basically. It's kind of like the same idea, but it's a little bit more a choppier progression as you're doing it. So then you try to build range or distance with time to the point where you're basically just like a few inches above the ground, and then you revert back to the starting push-up position, and then you just build for max reps. You build for time and retention. So I like this one a lot. Like, it's a little bit more of an advanced progression, but in GPP type work, I use it a lot with baseball guys. I like it.
Yeah, it's really good because it's challenging your shoulder stability at those, like, somewhat like vulnerable positions, because once you get good and you're pretty much arms straight over your head, you're controlling your whole body weight there, and at times on one hand. So it's like for like baseball and overhead athletes, if they can get into that position, it's a great position for them to be very strong in.
I think it's important too that people realize that when you're moving and doing a plank, that you're still supposed to stabilize the hips. Yeah. So a lot of times you'll see people do these movements where you're temporarily on one arm, but then their hips and their shoulders like will shift or drop or whatever. So you really gotta like cue them so that everything stays stable, as if the trunk is not moving at all, and then it's just like the limbs that are moving.
Well, to go along with Alex's point, that's also one of the reasons whenever we do conditioning workouts, one of the reasons why we love using animal walks is it allows you to work abdominal bracing ability while under dynamic movements, while being fatigued. So a good example would be like the bear crawl, right? How many people do you see once they start fatiguing, the hips are shifting left and right drastically as they're moving in space? Well, it means they're not stabilizing properly. So as a coach, you want to reinforce, maintain proper hip and proper torso position as you're moving your legs and arms, although you're fatigued. And if you're able to do this and you're training the athletic population, now you know that as they're exerting force or velocities in their sports and they're starting to get out of breath and tired, well, they have the inherent ability to maintain stability as they're doing their sporting action under fatigue, which reduces the likelihood of any type of injuries, because a lot of injuries happens once you start losing stability at high forces and high velocities. So it's just an important skill to have, and it's an important skill to reinforce as the coach.
Like the forward traveling beast is always something that people, like, they want to go fast, but the slower you do it and the more controlled you are, like, really, really works your abs.
Yeah, like one thing I used to do with my youth athletes was forward traveling beast, but they're going and they're racing, but I had something on their low back, and if it fell off, that's obviously they had to go back to the start. So it enforced the competitive nature, and they wanted to go fast, but they knew they couldn't. So it was a really fun one for them, while keeping a really high quality abdominals somewhat drill for it.
Okay, so moving on, Alex, I have the low ab drill on
Your
the list.
That is my favorite. The low ab drill is, I mean, there's many different like levels that you can do, but this is one where you really want to teach like incorporating the breathing into the bracing, and then while you're moving your body. So they start off. So I have a video on my Instagram because I've had a few people ask me, like, I don't understand what you're saying. But like, you're on your back. You want to really focus on pulling the ribs down, getting a pelvic tilt in. And then the first progression would be both feet on the ground. And then you're just moving one leg. The leg stays at 90 degrees at the knee. And then as you lower, you want to be able to take a deep breath in through the nose. And it's important to do a silent breath in, because a lot of people want to, because if you make a lot of noise, then you're tightening the wrong things up in the diaphragm. You really want, or in the throat, and you're not breathing through the diaphragm and the lower belly. So it's a silent inhale, and then you lower the leg, and then you exhale as you bring the leg back up. So that'll be the first variation, because then you don't have to stabilize the other leg into space. As you get better, then you would have both legs up and you're still doing it unilateral. And you want to try to make the inhale as slow as possible. So maybe in terms of like counting tempo, you can start with like a 3-second inhale, 3-second exhale, and then you progress to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, kind of like with the planks. And then once you've mastered that, then you can still do bent knee, but then bilateral. And then from there, you can do straight leg, unilateral, bilateral. That's a really tough one.
And are you, in general, doing this on a bench or on the ground?
I mean, you can do either. I like to do it on the bench because then you can brace, you can hold the bench.
To the bench.
You can also do it up against the wall, and then you're actually pushing into the wall with your hands. And then pushing into the wall it kind of helps force keep the ribs down. So I like that one too.
This is probably a good way for beginners getting into strength training to kind of make them more aware of their breathing and bracing during more compound movements as well.
Yeah, you'll see advanced people struggle with that one too. It's just something, but we don't really, if you haven't done it, like you can have really strong like rectus abdominis and lift a lot of weight, but then you ask them to do something that's really controlled and then he can't do it.
Yeah.
So,
because you recently had the low ab drill in your program, Steph.
There's a video. He's the one who's doing it in my video.
Yeah.
I mean, it's tough, especially like to me, like the one where incorporating the breathing into the mix, it makes it fairly challenging.
Yeah. Okay. The next one is another fun one. And I often find that people load this one improperly, but the Pallof press. So who wants to talk about the Pallof press in terms of execution?
The Pallof press, so in terms of, so when you start off, you want to make sure your feet are a little bit wider than your hips, and like the knees are bent, so that you have a really strong base of support. The pulley should be set up at about chest height, so that when you extend your arms, the pulley is at chest height, so that you're getting about 90 degrees between your arms and then the angle of the cable of the pulley. So from there, it's isometric contractions. So you can start at 4 seconds, build up to 6, 8 seconds, time under tension between 40 to 70 seconds on each side, depending on what they're doing. But as they're doing it, what you're looking for is the shoulders. A lot of people will start to shrug the shoulders, or they'll actually turn away from the pulley. So now they're making the lever a little bit less. They're shortening the lever. So make sure that the arms are going straight ahead, shoulder, chest height. Trying to think.
The worst part of Pallof press, ribs down is, but the worst part is that you always have that second side.
Yeah.
Oh, you just feel pukey after the first side and know you have to start the second side. It's awful.
But people don't use enough.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say about the loading. It needs to be a load where it's not hard for you to hold it, but it needs to be the challenge to brace it and get it out there. Because if you see people go way too heavy, so that it's slowly pulling them in the entire time. So you still need to keep it in front of you, but it needs to be heavy enough where it's a challenge.
Yeah. Like Porrick, remember 2 years ago when we were doing synchronized Pallof?
Yeah, I do remember that. We're using a shit ton of weight because we didn't want the other person to use more.
but it's tough. Like when you have like almost the entire stack in the pulley system, and you're like holding super tight and you're taking like short breath to maintain like stability. I mean, you get out of breath and you get kind of pukey.
Yeah, and between every rep, you're returning back to your chest, then straightening your arms again, holding it out for the isometric pause, then back. Yeah,
it's just that like the thing is, if you want to optimize isometric type of actions, like you're always better off taking a short intraset rest period to allow you to reoxygenate a little bit, because I mean it's not going to be full, a little bit the tissue, because when you're taking a super long non-stop isometric contractions, you're making it almost impossible for oxygenation of the tissue. So at least it allows you to have a higher average output as you're doing the movement.
Yeah, so while we will write something like 1018 as the tempo, it's okay to take a second or two between reps, get a breath in, and then go again.
One thing that just popped into my mind that I like with a lot of not specifically this one, that's not a good example to bring it up on, but in terms of a lot of the ab work when we programming it, we write max reps, because sometimes depending on the exercise, I can get like a hanging leg raise with an extended eccentric. Maybe I'll get 4 reps the first time I do it. So that's why we write max reps, because I'm going to try to get as many reps as I can to do it. Yeah,
but it's also, we write max reps on exercises that aren't inherently easy to add additional load.
Yeah.
So once they're inherently bodyweight exercise, like of course hanging leg raises, gar hammers, you can add weight, but it's hard. So at that stage it's just easier to say max reps and then pick the variation to the difficulty to roughly to where the reps you want them to fall into.
You don't want to use the monkey feet and get set up on those every time.
But it's like, it's one of these things where a good practice as a coach is, depending on the tempo you're using with the movement, like you would put like max reps, but keeping in mind that the ultimate rep target would be something like 15 or 20 reps, just depending on the tempo. So let's say you're doing 15-degree gar hammer raise, and the client starts and can only pop out 11 reps. because you write max and he does 11. Okay, you maintain that exercise and he fights to build more and more reps. The day that he can reach 15, so let's say you have 3 sets and he does 3 sets of 15 with a 3-0-1-0 tempo. Okay, so that's 60 seconds of time under tension. Now, like I don't want him to keep going max reps forever. Now he's reached a certain amount of rep volume that I'm happy with. So now all you need to do, because it's just a pain and harder to add weight, is now you make the exercise more difficult by changing the angle. So now we might bump it up to a, let's say, 35-degree inclined gar hammer. So now it's more challenging. So now we might only be able to do 8 reps at 35 degrees. And then you build it back up again, same type of thing. So that's just a very natural, linear progression type of approach you can use.
Okay. Moving on to another exercise on the, well, I have 2 more that we use on the pulley. So the first one being the wood chop.
Wood chop, you can do a high pulley wood chop. You can do a low pulley wood chop. The setup, again, you're sideways to the pulley. Let's say we're doing a high pulley wood chop. Your arms are straight. Again, your base is your legs are wider than your hips, slightly bent, ribs down, and you turn and face the pulley. And as you go from the high pulley, you're trying to aim your arms in a straight arm, like you're chopping diagonal in front of you, so that your hands finish in front of the opposite hip. So you're really doing your rotation that way. A lot of times we see people where they're trying to keep their torso straight or their body straight, and then they're just moving the arms like I don't know how to describe it, but so basically you want the whole body to move at the same time. And the thing that I know you struggle with this at the beginning, yeah. But the feet. So the feet, it's kind of like you want to do a follow through with your whole body. So the feet will move. So you'll pivot onto your toes depending in what direction that you're facing. But it's really although you're rotating, it's almost an anti-rotation because you're not trying to twist the spine. You're trying to really initiate from the obliques as you turn.
Yeah, so at least according to Stuart McGill, courses we've done with him in the past, he was showing how the spine is not necessarily meant to really rotate and twist. Okay, at least not under higher loads. So that's why, a wood chop, it's not necessarily a broomstick, a twist, back in the days. Like Alex is saying, it's almost anti-rotation in the sense that you're keeping your arms in front of your sternum, and as you're rotating, the hips and the trunk are following your head and your hands. And because your hips are following through, the feet are going to have to move through a follow-through, kind of the way you would in a golf swing or a baseball swing. And if you look at a baseball swing and a golf swing, it's not a twisting of the spine. It's a follow through of the hips. So it's the same thing we're doing with the wood chop.
And I know with the Pallof press, but with the wood chop, is it only ever standing or can you do variations?
You can do kneeling, half kneeling.
Okay, so with both the Pallof and the wood chop, you can do.
And then you're better off starting with the high pulley because it's more manageable. You can also do mid pulley as well. Sure. But then the I don't want to say advanced, but the last progression would be a low pulley. It's a little bit harder, a little bit more challenging. And it's interesting too because it also engages serratus anterior at the same time. So you have a little bit of a double whammy component to it.
Okay, the final one on the pulley I have on the list is a crunch seated high pulley.
This is Steph's invention.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's my invention, but I like it.
Popularized it.
It's, the kneeling high pulley crunch is one of my favorite spinal flexion abdominal exercise. Maybe it's because when I was younger, I saw Arnold in Pumping Iron do it while he's chewing gum and stuff. But what I did notice after coaching the kneeling crunch for a long time, a lot of people struggle with the kneeling crunch because the hips are
to find the positioning.
Because the hips are not fixed. So they tend to move the hips a little too much and they're struggling. So the seated high pulley crunch, you basically get into a lat pull down machine, but you use a rope attachment, and then you sit in the pull down and you lock your thighs underneath the padding. So now you're sitting, the hips is fixed. And then from that position, you actually flare the ribs to create a little bit of a spine extension. And then you crunch as if you're doing a crunch on the floor, but from an extended position. So you're increasing range of motion. And then you're crunching. But it's much easier to feel and learn because everything is stable. Once the client gets a feel of this, then you can put them kneeling on the floor, and they're usually going to be much better at doing it. But it's good because at one point, like if you struggle with that one, then you have to revert to the super old school where you're on your back on the floor with your calves elevated on a bench, and you're just doing a crunch from the floor simply because now the demands are less. It's a very simplistic movement. But it's limiting because the spine should be able to extend about 15 degrees and flex about 30 degrees. So we want, if we're doing spinal flexion, to work that 40-degree range of motion. So that's why these pulley versions are kind of good. But it is like a straight-up sagittal plane, spinal flexion, trun flexion type of movement. And it's just good at learning how to control that flexion. I really like it.
Yeah. The biggest problem with it is you can end up using a shit ton of weight.
Yeah, that's true.
So it can be really tough in your hands. So
yeah, that's why like ropes with loops where you can just attach to your wrists.
The spreader bar is still my favorite way of doing it. The prime spreader bar.
Yeah.
Just because of the whatever that style of handle is, it just takes the pressure off your grip altogether.
Yeah.
But
okay, so moving on to two variations done on the Swiss ball. First, I have the knee pull-in. So with these, again, there's different variations in terms of doing it bilateral, unilateral to increase the challenge. But you guys tend to use these a lot with a lot of different types of clients, these variations.
Definitely more of an advanced client because one, they have to be able to maintain that push-up position and the plank position. And and then because it's really easy to cheat. If you do the knee pull-in and you're just kind of like
moving the ball
back and forth, you won't feel anything in your abs. But if you're really maintaining your pelvic tilt, and then as you pull the ball in, if you can maintain your shin parallel to the floor, so your elbows are your knees are aiming for your armpit, then you can really feel it in your abs. But you have to, the plank has to be solid.
Yep.
It's a little bit more advanced because now we're adding the challenge of, working the abdominal wall with a stabilization component. So you need to, first be able to stabilize in a more stable environment, and then you need to be able to generate force in trunk flexion in a stable environment before now we can further challenge with this variation. It's kind of like when we were talking about the lower body, how we're saying that you start with split squats. Once you're strong at split squats, you move on to lunge. It's a little bit more challenging. You're really strong in lunge, well, the pistol squat, now it's even more challenging. So it's a little bit of the same idea. You're adding complexity to challenge the abdominal wall.
Yeah, and with these two, I think it goes back to what you were saying, how important it is to keep the scap retracted, stay tight in that area and solid as well.
And head neutral as well.
Yep.
You don't want people tend to extend the neck. You really want to keep that neutral cervical spine as much as possible.
The second one I had was the jackknife on the Swiss ball.
Yeah, so just another progression again, because it's very similar to the knee pull-in, but you're doing a similar movement, but it's with straight legs, so you're moving into like a pike position. So if someone has weak hip flexors, they are going to hate this variation. But it's also another great one for challenging shoulder stability, because in the end range, like in the fully contracted position, you're basically going to be very close to a handstand position.
Yeah.
So and you're going from pretty much a press up position into that handstand position. So your shoulders are stabilizing through a really decent range of motion and for appreciable time under tension. So yeah, it could be a really good one to incorporate that.
For the viewers or strength and conditioning coaches, this one is really, really good with your high level athletes that have to deal with team sports, that have a lot of sprinting and change of direction. Because what's good about this, like the jackknife really isolates the hip flexors. The strongest, most powerful muscle of the hip flexor structure is the psoas. Okay, the psoas is extremely powerful. So this really works the psoas like crazy. But what's interesting with the ball component is now, as you're working this, which will help with like stride force output and on, you have that stabilizing element at the shoulders and at the trunk at the same time. So if you're able to build strength there and stability in the extremities as you're doing it, then you're going to see indirectly help in these change of direction movement at high speed and high forces. So it's a good movement to introduce with your athletes once they're able to do more basic type of stuff.
Okay.
One really easy way to make it, if someone gets very, very professional at it, is to start introducing slow concentrics.
Yeah.
Because
those
we've
suck,
done it. So like 3-0, 3-0 and 5-0, 5-0 sort of tempos. So you're really controlling every inch of that movement. Oh, it sucks so much worse. It makes it so much harder.
Any of leg.
All of the once you play around with those tempos on some of these ab variations, it just completely changes the game for how difficult they become. I know we kind of already talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to go into it a little bit more, is the Garhammer raise.
So John Garhammer, professor at the University of Long Beach in California, he I mean, I don't like, who knows if he invented it, but he definitely popularized it, hence the name Garhammer raise. So the purpose of the Garhammer raise is to work the hip flexion component of the trunk, but minimizing a little bit the impact of the hip flexors by having the hip flexor already flexed at the beginning of the movement. So because you start with the femur perpendicular to the torso, you're already flexed. So now you're able to further isolate the rectus abdominis with a little bit less involvement of the hip flexors. And then, so from that supine position where you're holding a sturdy object, like either the bench behind you or ropes or a bar behind you or whatever it might be, you basically flex the lower body. So you bring your knees towards your chest, and then you eccentrically go back down to that starting position, but you never want to go beyond that 90-degree position. So you're at the lowest position, your femur are perpendicular to your spine.
In terms of progressions, where obviously like the most advanced would be the hanging progression. So where would you start individuals with these?
Flat,
and then go to even like a small incline.
Bigger incline.
And then I know, so you can do it on a bench where you're doing it, but we also like to do it on the decline bench.
Yeah, I mean, we use the decline simply because the way the decline bench is built, it's easy to attach a little rope attachment to hold yourself, which is just, it's more comfortable than going to extreme shoulder flexion to grab the bench behind you. That's the only reason why. Like even me, like I'm sure you saw me, like I set the decline bench in a power rack and actually hold a barbell over my chest. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's just a comfort question on how you're stabilizing yourself with your hands.
The decline bench, and this is maybe just the Atlantis one, but since it's a little wider at the top, it's great just so you don't feel like you're going to fall off the bench.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so the gar hammer, it's that variation where the femur is perpendicular to the spine. You're taking away from the hip flexors and you're creating a shorter lever. So then a natural progression from the gar hammer would simply be a leg raise. So hanging leg raise would be the ultimate, where now it's a longer lever. And now you can actually start from a fully lengthened position where you're like completely erect. So like the femur is in line with your torso. And one thing that you can do to take away a little bit the hip flexors is internally rotating the femur. Okay, so I usually get my toes together, but it's important to understand.
The leg.
It's not just the toes that are pointing together. It's actually an internal rotation of the femur to kind of inhibit a little bit the hip flexors as you're going up.
Okay, so I know because you do sometimes use standard sit-ups or crunches in programming, but one sit-up variation that I've loved in my programming is the Jonda sit-up. So, Steph, can you kind of talk a little bit about the Jonda?
So, Vladimir Janda from Czech Republic.
History lesson number 2.
So, I mean, it's fairly old. We're talking about the late 70s. He was more of a physiotherapist, and he was trying to figure a way to work the rectus abdominis and minimizing the impact of the hip flexors. I mean, to be quite honest, in the last 15 years, it's been a little bit debunked in research, but it doesn't matter. I still think it's a good exercise, irrespective of how much the hip flexor is involved. So, but the idea originally was that you're doing a sit-up, like a straight-up sit-up, where your spine is as neutral as possible as you're flexing the torso. And then your knees are bent 90 degrees. But instead of hooking your feet under a sturdy object or having a partner holding your feet, you actually flex the knee. So you do a knee flexion onto a sturdy object, and you're creating stability by doing, if you want, a half or a mid-position leg curl. And the idea was by activating the hamstring, the knee flexors, you're taking away some of the activation of the hip flexors, so you would isolate the rectus abdominis a little bit more. But like I was saying, I think it's the last 15 years, they were like, I'm not sure it's taking it away as much as originally taught. But like I said, I still like it. It's still really challenging. It's kind of a fun variation to the traditional sit-up with the feet hooked under a pad.
I like it a lot. And then the final one I have selected, obviously, is the dragon flag.
Ooh.
I mean, I'm sorry. I love that one. I love that one. I don't know why it's called dragon flag, so I don't have a little history lesson here for it. But the reason why I probably love it, to be honest, probably has to do with Rocky IV. When I was a kid watching Rocky IV, and I saw Stallone in the barn that's supposedly in Siberia. It's probably in Wyoming or Colorado or something. But anyways, he's in a barn on a beam 30 feet from the ground, and he's doing these dragon flag, and you see the abs and all that kind of stuff. But anyways, the dragon flag is a anti-extension exercise that is extremely challenging. And so the way you're doing it is you lie supine on a bench, you hold the bench at ear level, and then you can do it two ways. You can do it with a short lever where you're bending your knees 90 degrees, or you can do like our standard with athletes where you have your arms, your legs straight. So basically everything is aligned. The torso is aligned with the legs. The knees are extended. You internally rotate your femur. Okay, although it doesn't have a ton of impact because we're not really flexing the spine, but I like to reinforce that action with every ab exercise so that it becomes second nature to the client. And then from that supine position, you flex and you brace the abs as hard as you can, and then you try to raise your entire body, and the pivot point basically becomes your upper back and neck, and you're pivoting across the upper back and neck while keeping your legs aligned with your torso through that entire range of motion, which will be from flat to, I don't know, like 70 degrees-ish.
Yeah. If you want to rest, you can go up higher.
Yeah, if you want to rest, go all the way up because there's no more tension. Then you just very under control. You go up and down. Like usually I'll go to a 4-0-1 or 4-0-2-0, like realistically speaking, type of tempo, and you just build up reps. And through my experience training athletes, whenever I got an athlete to be able to do 8 reps, like 6 to 8 reps with that 4-0-1-0 tempo on a dragon flag, I mean, ab strength was pretty good, and that's where you saw like really, really good numbers on these big primary compound lifts. Like usually, like at that point, ab strength will be a non-issue on expression of force on a squat or a deadlift and stuff like that. So that's why, to me, it's a great abdominal strength standard with athletes.
I like doing the accentuated eccentric version where you kind of cheat yourself up. Yeah. Like, so when you're first introducing it, and then you can just like lower it, and then you can do, your 4 to 6 second eccentric.
Yeah. And then you can also do like the, like in the lower body podcast that we did when Porrick was talking about the Nordic curl progression, where you're doing progressive range reps. You can kind of do the same thing as well. You just start higher, then you can progress because it's significantly harder. Like that first 30 degrees from the floor. Yeah,
to come up.
Yeah, that's the hardest part. So you can start by avoiding that part and then increase the range of motion over time.
So I know we initially started this episode by saying it would be abdominals and lower back, but I'm thinking we save the lower back for the next episode.
Chatty.
So we're going to end the abdominal episode now. But to wrap this one up, I wanted to quickly go over something I'm very excited about that we're introducing this year for our personalized programming clients. So our OTAs. So for personalized programming clients, included in your membership will be OTAs, but we are also opening this up to anyone who is looking to come to Kilo and get assessed by us. So on our website, it is now called the Strength Assessment Workshop. So these workshops will be 2 days. The first one this year is October 19th and the 20th. So it's a Saturday and Sunday this year in October. So if you're training online with us, this is included in your membership. You come, no additional cost, and we assess you. We'll be doing body composition assessments and comprehensive strength assessments. So this will enable us to further individualize your programming. And then if you're coming as someone who doesn't train online with us, it will identify strengths and weaknesses, and then you can take that to then go help your programming on your own. Does anyone have anything that they want to quickly talk about on the strength assessment workshop?
Well, there's also like training sessions included. So they're going to be more like functional hypertrophy type strength sessions. And there's going to be a few
high-level discussions.
Some discussions on some targeted topics. But that'll be fun. So we're excited because it's our first time doing this, but we feel that it's going to be it's going to be fun for the clients, but it's going to be really good for us to further enhance the results that we have with our online clients, because it's going to allow us to have a little bit more hands-on view of our clients' issues and limitations.
So in the 2-day workshop, the comprehensive assessments will be a body composition assessment, a trunk assessment, individualized 1RM continuum, primate analysis, eccentric tolerance assessment, primary and remedial strength ratio analysis. And then the high-level discussions, we will be doing a nutrition optimization discussion, performance supplementation, general and specific warm-up procedures, training load management, and then we'll end each day 1 and day 2 with a Q&A. So I just think it's going to be a really fun environment to be around. It'll give us the opportunity to finally meet some of our clients that we haven't met, but just as well, even for people that are looking to get a solid assessment to take home to prepare their own programming, or even you can do a consultation with us to kind of help guide you in how you should prepare your programs. I think it's going to be a really engaging and enlightening for a lot of people to actually go through some assessments with us. Okay, so I know we started this episode by saying we're going to talk about lower back, but that will be next time. See you next week, fam.